It's easy for mythical birds to capture the imagination, whether it's the phoenix rising from the ashes or Aethon eternally pecking Prometheus's liver. And let's not forget Odin with his ravens Huginn and Muninn, or memory and thought. In Norse myth, they travelled out into the world and flew back to Odin to report on what was happening. Some mythical birds are even composite creatures. Look at the cockatrice with its serpent's body and tail and a rooster's head, wings and legs. Or how about the sirens, the singing bird women that so captivated Odysseus? Their avian qualities often give these creatures the power of flight. But of course not all mythical birds are benevolent or even particularly well known, as we shall see. So let's explore the folklore of the phoenix, the firebird, the martlet and the Nachtkrapp in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I'm going to apologise in advance if my voice starts to go a bit funny because I have been having problems with it again, which is really helpful when you're a podcaster and a public speaker, but there we go. We'll see how I get on. So if it does end up getting deeper, that's why. It's just my vocal cords are doing something really bizarre at the moment. But anyway, this is our final episode of the theme of birds, which I've actually been quite enjoying, if I'm completely honest with you. It was a request by one of you lovely listeners, and it has been really interesting looking into these different birds. Obviously, there's tons more birds than I've looked at in this theme, so we probably will revisit it at some point, because why not? And just in case you didn't hear last week's episode, next month we're going to have a look at the folklore of islands and have a look at some various island-based folklore and so on as well. Now we're just going to jump into the episode now because that's why you're here after all, and we are going to start off with the phoenix, which is probably the mythical bird that you would think of if somebody said name a mythical bird. And the legends of the phoenix essentially come from the work of Herodotus, who was recording Egyptian traditions in the 5th century BCE, and one of these traditions was the idea of the phoenix, and it was a bird with red-gold plumage that emitted sunlight. Now the phoenix lived for 500 years, feeding on Arabian balsam and frankincense, and at the end of this 500-year period, the phoenix died and then a new bird emerged from its body. The new phoenix encased the dead phoenix in a myrrh egg and then used this to carry its corpse to the temple at Heliopolis where it would be burned. Now in this description, the phoenix looks a lot like an eagle, and I think that that's probably how most people might picture the phoenix now. If indeed you picture it at all, I don't know, you might not. But other variations suggested that the phoenix actually wove generative powers into his nest to enable the new phoenix to rise after he died. And this is a thing I noticed in quite a lot of the sources I looked at. The phoenix is often referred to as he, and the new phoenix would only take its predecessor to Heliopolis once the new one was fully grown. Now, according to Ovid, the phoenix lined the nest with cassia and spikenard, golden myrrh and shreds of cinnamon before death, all of these apparently giving it this generative power. In other variations, the phoenix entered the fire when he reached 500 or 1461 years old, depending on the source. And the more familiar story involving the funeral pyre sees the phoenix rise from the ashes of his predecessor, but once fully grown, he still takes the remains of the previous body to Heliopolis to be burned. And it's this idea of the phoenix being reborn from ashes that is perhaps most prevalent here in the 21st century, with the concept of a phoenix rising from the ashes usually used to reference someone who has staged some kind of comeback after adversity. Now, some scholars have actually suggested Bennu, the ancient Egyptian god of creation and rebirth, may have inspired legends of the phoenix. An Old Kingdom artwork shows Bennu as a kingfisher, but in the New Kingdom, artwork then depicts Bennu as a grey heron. So much like the griffin, the phoenix also appears as a creature in medieval bestiaries without necessarily starring in specific myths. But of course the phoenix isn't the only fiery bird in myth, and we also have the firebird who appears in Slavic myths and folklore, which can bring both blessings or doom to those who encounter it, depending on which way the story goes. Its golden feathers glow even when plucked from the bird. Now, the Firebird is usually an object in the stories that prompts a quest rather than a character in its own right. So the hero, for example, might find a tail feather and then try to find the bird itself, which often causes more trouble for the hero than the feather is actually worth. And I wanted to actually tell one of these stories just to give you an idea of how the Firebird can cause havoc essentially just by existing. And this one is from the Firebird and Princess Vasilisa, which was translated by Irina Zeletova. And in this particular story, an archer finds a firebird's feather just kind of lying on the road. And his horse, who can talk, advises him to leave it alone and warns him of misfortune if he does pick it up. But the archer somewhat stupidly ignores his horse because he thinks the feather will make a fine present for the king. Now, unfortunately, while the king does reward the archer, he also decides that the feather isn't enough and he wants the whole bird. Even more, if the archer can't present the Firebird, the king will behead the archer. So it's like, find the Firebird or lose your head, which is a bit harsh. So the archer obviously despairs of his future at this point because he has no idea where to find a Firebird and tells his horse about it. Now the horse tells him not to worry and instructs him to spread corn over a nearby field. The following dawn, the Firebird lands in the field to eat the corn, whereupon the archer captures the bird and takes it to the king. Well, what do you know, the king still isn't satisfied, so he then orders the archer to fetch Princess Vasilisa because he wants to marry her, and he again threatens execution if the archer fails. Again, the horse comes to the rescue and tells the archer to procure food, drink and a tent with a golden top. Now, the princess basically lives right by the sea, so when the archer finally reaches where she lives, he sets up his tent on the shore, lays out the spread of food and sits down to wait. Eventually, the princess, who's out in a rowboat at sea, spots the tent because its golden top is glinting in the sun, and she comes over to join him. Now, the archer plies her with food and drink. It sounds like they actually have quite a jolly time until she falls asleep. So at this point, the archer packs everything away and rides back to the king with the sleeping princess. Now, the king showers the archer with riches as promised, but now Princess Vasilisa is absolutely distraught at being so far from home. She refuses to marry the king without her wedding dress, which lies beneath a rock in the sea. So the king commands the archer to fetch it, again making the usual threat of execution. And again, the horse saves the day, and when they reach Vasilisa's beloved sea, the horse persuades a lobster to fetch the dress. So the archer and the horse return with the wedding dress, but then Princess Vasilisa refuses to marry unless her condition is met. And it's a particularly harsh condition because the archer has to climb into a cauldron of boiling water. You can sort of see a point considering the fact that he did kidnap her, but there we go. Despite the archer's hard work, the king agrees and has the cauldron filled with water, has a fire stoked underneath and sets it to boil. Now before the archer climbs in, he's like, do you know what, can I just go and say goodbye to my horse before I die? And the king's like, yep, sure, go and say goodbye to your horse. So the archer goes to see the horse. And he tells him what's about to happen. Now the horse, rightfully I think, reminds the archer that he had warned him about what was going to happen, but he's not going to let the archer go that easily, so he casts a protective spell over the archer. The archer goes back to the room where the king is, and when the king's men throw him into the cauldron, he doesn't suffer. Far from it, in fact, he actually emerges more handsome than ever from the boiling water. Now, seeing this transformation, the king decides he too wants to improve his looks and dives straight into the cauldron. Obviously, he's lacking the horse's protective spell, so the king dies in the boiling water. Now, luckily, the king's men choose the archer to rule in his place, and he marries Princess Vasilisa, and apparently they actually live quite happily ever after. And while the story doesn't specify it, I do hope in future that he did actually listen to his horse's advice. But the story just goes to show that if he'd actually listened to the horse, he wouldn't have had to go through all of those trials, although you could argue, because the horse helps him, the Firebird does actually end up putting the archer in a position where he's now ruling the kingdom and has a wife. So it's a difficult one to gauge whether he wins or loses in that one, but you can see why the Firebird basically becomes the catalyst for that particular type of transformation that he goes through. Now, there are way more versions of Firebird stories than I can retell here, but if you are interested in them, I would recommend seeking them out. Alexander Afanasiev actually collected almost 600 folktales around the Slavic region in the 19th century, very much like the work that the Grimm brothers were doing, and these stories are available in his Russian fairy tales collection. And Irina Zeleznova also collected and translated stories which you can actually find on archive.org, and the link is in the show notes. Sergei Diaghilev actually commissioned composer Igor Stravinsky to score a ballet, The Firebird, in 1910. And in this, the Firebird is a woman/bird creature, so she's kind of a bit of a hybrid of both. And Prince Ivan captures her, but then she gives him a magic feather, so he basically sets her free. And then Ivan goes on to defeat the evil Koshai the Immortal, free his 13 captive princesses, and then marry one of them. So again, the magic feather ends up becoming the catalyst of what happens, rather than the Firebird really being the main character. And on a totally unrelated point, Stravinsky and Diaghilev are both buried on Venice's Isola di San Michele cemetery island, which I thought was quite interesting. But I do think if you are interested in Firebird stories, do seek them out from the original Slavic sources, because there are so many of them to have a look at. Now we're going to completely change gear from the fiery birds of the Phoenix and the Firebird to the Martlet, which you might not have heard of because it's not a particularly well known one, but it does appear in English heraldry, and a Martlet is a mythical bird with no feet that looks a lot like a swift. In legend, they live entirely in the air because they're unable to roost like other birds, having no feet and all. And the Martlet is actually born on the wing and then also commits a death fall when it dies, so it literally spends its whole time flying. The swift is perhaps the closest real bird to the Martlet because they even sleep while they're flying, although they can land during breeding season. In heraldry, the Martlet represents continual effort, and Edward the Confessor had 5 Martlets on his attributed arms. Now, its name comes from the bird martin with the let added, so it means little martin, and no one knows where the name actually came from, although some have suggested a link with Martinmas in November, at which point house martins have usually begun their migration south for the winter. And house martins feed their young on the wing, which could again explain this mistaken assumption that martlets never land. Now, martlets don't appear in superstitions because obviously they're not actually real, but they do occasionally crop up in other places. So Banquo refers to the temple-haunting martlet as a guest of summer in Macbeth when he and Duncan are outside on a summer evening. Now, it's likely that that actually refers to the martlet as another name for the house martin, but it was quite interesting to see the name appear outside heraldry, which is pretty much where you mostly find it. If you actually look it up in journal articles, you get a lot of articles about coins as well, because martlets tend to appear as devices on coins and so on. So it's quite interesting to see how they end up in these other mentions as well. But we're going to finish up with the Nachtkrapp, which translates as the night raven, and this is a creature from stories from southern Germany and Austria. And these stories are apparently most often used to scare children into going to bed because the Nachtkrapp hunts at night. And it hunts children that are outside past sunset, with the implication being that if you go to bed on time, you'll be fast asleep when the Nachtkrapp comes by. There are some parallels with figures like the Sandman, and you do also get, I suppose to an extent, also like Gryla in Icelandic folklore, the idea that if you behave in a particular way, then this thing won't happen to you. So it is very much used to try and ensure good behaviour. Now, in some versions, the Nachtkrapp is actually a figure who snatches up children outside after dark and then takes them away in a sack. In Austria, the Nachtkrapp is the raven that eats children, and in central Thuringia, the birds flock together and actually snatch children who are outside after sunset. So there obviously are variations when you're in different parts of the region, as you tend to find with a lot of different types of folklore. Now, some stories say that it has no eyes, others say it'll bring death to anyone that looks into its eyes, and given it can only be seen by children, this does support the idea that children should go to bed before night falls. Variations see it being the size of an eagle or spreading sickness when it flies. It does pretty much seem like it only appears in this story that is passed on by parents to children by essentially using it as a threat. There aren't stories of adults encountering it or anything like that. There is, however, a benevolent version in the Burgenland region known as the Gute Nachtkrapp, and this version sings children to sleep, which is a really lovely idea, but stories of that particular version are far less common. No one really knows where this legend originally comes from, although Johann August Appel includes night ravens in his short story Der Freischütz from Volume 1 of the Gespensterbuch from 1810. And in this one, they're kind of more part of the scene setting rather than them being characters in their own right, which is something that I think we see with a lot of these mythical birds. They kind of appear more like set dressing or an incidental character in something rather than them being a character in their own right. And I think this basically feeds into what we can actually make of these mythical birds, because when you look at the phoenix, there's these traditions collected of them, and different writers in the classical period are writing about them, but then there's not like one specific myth that you can point to and go, that is a phoenix story. Unlike something like a dragon, which has a named story, depending on where you are. Lots of places have them. Obviously, I've covered lots of dragon stories on the podcast, but phoenixes don't have the equivalent. The Firebird, on the other hand, appears in tons of stories, but again, not as a main character. It is there to motivate the action that follows, for good or ill. The Martlet is a weird one because of the fact it only really appears in heraldry, so it's bizarre that it is a mythical bird but doesn't really have any stories attached to it, other than the fact that it has no feet, which might explain why it's appeared in heraldry, because maybe, I don't know, someone might not have wanted to draw them. It could be something as simple as that. And then the Nachtkrapp is a really interesting one because there's not a huge amount associated with it. And if you actually try to look it up, a lot of the stuff all just kind of refers back to the same things. So it's a little bit more difficult. But I do find that the thing is really interesting about the Firebird and the Nachtkrapp in particular is the fact that there are benevolent versions and there are versions that are decidedly less benevolent. But they also show that these mythical birds, just because they're mythical, there is a degree of hazard associated with them as well. And I think that allows us to explore ideas through mythical birds rather than necessarily having to include real birds. Although, as we saw with the ornamental birds, look at how many death omens are associated with poor doves, or how bad luck Odin peacock feathers is. So I think it's really interesting that in some ways real birds kind of almost have worse folklore associated with them than the mythical ones, which end up just kind of being story like characters in these wider stories. And obviously there are many more mythical birds to choose from. I didn't want to do Huginn and Muninn because I kind of feel like you could almost do a whole episode on them just on their own, but obviously lots of different cultures have stories about birds, and obviously it's better to go directly to those cultures to find out more about them and so on, I think. And also we've got running time to bear in mind here as well, so that's why I've kind of had to pick and choose which ones to include. I did almost include Owlman, but I think that's something for a different type of episode, really. So I do hope that you have enjoyed the folklore of birds, and I do hope that you'll also enjoy the folklore of islands in September. Otherwise, I will see you next week, and I hope you have a marvellous week ahead. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.